The Supreme High Council of the YLTRX Dominion had debated the invasion of Earth for exactly 7 minutes. 7 minutes was generous. Frankly, they could have settled it in 4, but Admiral Xylox had a habit of over-explaining things, and no one wanted to be rude. Earth was, by all estimations, an insignificant backwater world. The species that called themselves humans had only barely managed interplanetary travel, spent an embarrassing amount of their economy on entertainment, and seemed to voluntarily poison themselves with fermented substances while engaging in what could only be described as enthusiastic mutual destruction for sport. A few high-level scientists on YLTRX had proposed that humans were uniquely dangerous due to their resilience. These scientists had been laughed at, relieved of duty, and one had been thrown out of an airlock, gently on a lower gravity setting as they weren't complete monsters. The invasion fleet was dispatched. A glorious triumph awaited. 12 minutes and 43 seconds later, the YLTRX forces were in full retreat. Supreme Commander Bevrax, who had spent the last 3 minutes of the battle screaming into his command console, had just finished. Emergency calculations to ensure his ship didn't crash, land into a cityscape of doom. The YLTRX fleet had landed in a place called Australia. No one had warned them about Australia. No one had told them that the dominant life forms on this continent operated on what seemed to be a perpetual death wish. Their initial scouting team had been eliminated within 90 seconds. The enemy, a creature classified as Macropus giganteus. The humans called them kangaroos. Kangaroos were supposed to be herbivores. That was a blatant lie. Kangaroos were berserkers. The YLTRX soldiers had barely taken their first samples before one of these horrifying creatures had launched itself. 20 feet through the air, drop-kicked a fully armed trooper through his own transport pod, and stolen a plasma rifle. By the time reinforcements arrived, the Kangaroos had apparently formed an impromptu militia. One of them had figured out how to fire the plasma rifle. Another had climbed inside an abandoned hover tank and was rapidly pressing buttons with what could only be described as sadistic glee. When the retreat order was given, it wasn't just because the YLTRX forces were losing, it was because they were losing badly. A squad of specially trained enforcers, wearing reinforced battle armor, had been routed by a smaller breed of kangaroo, one the humans called a wallaby, which, despite its cute-sounding name, had fought with the tactical precision of a seasoned war veteran and the rage of a creature who knew the meaning of vengeance. Supreme Commander Bevrax had barely managed to get his flagship into orbit before a human aircraft carrier fired warning shots. But the carrier wasn't even shooting at them. It was firing at a pack of saltwater crocodiles that had apparently hijacked a fishing boat. Something was very, very wrong with this planet. The escape pods were launched, the survivors were counted, and the entire fleet entered hyperspace, abandoning the idea of conquest in favor of rethinking their entire life choices. But the YLTRX Dominion was not done yet. The Supreme High Council, upon reviewing the footage, refused to believe what they had seen. Obviously, they said, this was a mistake, a miscalculation. We are an advanced species, a civilization spanning hundreds of star systems. We shall not be thwarted by marsupials. A delegation would be sent, a diplomatic envoy, not for surrender, certainly not for surrender, but to open peaceful negotiations with the humans, if only to better understand how they survived. Thus, Ambassador Zrixil was sent to Earth. He would meet with their leaders. He would make first contact, and most importantly, he would learn the truth about kangaroos. High Ambassador Zrixil had been briefed extensively before setting foot on Earth. His mission was clear: assess humanity's capabilities, establish diplomatic ties, and most importantly, determine whether this species was a potential ally, a threat, or some horrifying combination of both. What he hadn't been briefed on, however, was why exactly the previous invasion force had fled screaming into the void. The YLTRX Dominion still refused to accept the idea that their military, one of the most advanced in the known galaxy, had been obliterated in under 13 minutes by the local wildlife. Surely there had been some other factor, some unseen force that had driven their warriors into retreat. A miscommunication, a technical failure, a rogue solar flare. Zaraxil would get to the bottom of it. Upon landing, his diplomatic vessel was immediately surrounded by humans in formal uniforms. They didn't look particularly threatening, none of them carried weapons, though they did have strangely calm expressions, which unsettled him more than it should have. A woman stepped forward, adjusting a pair of dark lenses covering her eyes. "Welcome to Earth," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Commander Rachel Dawson, your liaison for this diplomatic exchange. Let's make this painless." Zaraxil hesitated. He had read about this strange human ritual, the handshake, a bizarre form of greeting where two individuals grasped each other's manipulators and, for reasons unknown, vigorously wobbled them. Tentatively, he extended a limb and allowed Dawson to grip it. The motion was firm, too firm. He resisted the urge to yank his appendage back in alarm. "I have come to negotiate terms," he said, clearing his throat. "Our Dominion seeks an understanding between our species." Dawson nodded. "Yeah, that's great. But before we get to the formalities, we thought you might want a little tour first. Get a feel for the planet. You know, see how we live." Zaraxil did not want this. He wanted negotiations. He wanted structure. He wanted information that would make sense, but it was clear that humanity operated on its own set of priorities. So, the tour began. It started with what they called a wildlife sanctuary. "This is a safe place," Dawson assured him as they stepped into an enclosure. "A great spot to see some of Earth's most fascinating creatures up close." Zaraxil surveyed his surroundings. It did not look safe. There was a fence. It was low, laughably low. On the other side of it, a creature stood on its powerful hind legs, its muscular frame tensed with unnatural energy. Its front limbs hung in a way that seemed oddly calculating, like a warrior preparing to engage in unarmed combat. Zaraxil's translator pinged. "Macropus giganteus," a kangaroo. It was staring at him. The ambassador glanced at Dawson. "This is the species that annihilated our invasion force?" "Annihilated is a strong word," Dawson said, shrugging. "Let's say they strongly encouraged your people to reconsider their life choices." The kangaroo continued to stare. Then, without warning, it flexed. Its muscles bulged in a way that should not have been possible. This was not a mere herbivore. This was not some passive, grass-eating creature. This was a living war machine. Zaraxil took a cautious step back. The kangaroo took a step forward. "Does it understand my movements?" Zaraxil asked. Dawson pursed her lips. "Yeah, they kinda do that. Kangaroos are real perceptive. Pick up on body language fast. I'd avoid making any sudden..." Zaraxil turned too quickly. The kangaroo reacted. It launched itself at the fence. In an instant, it was perched on top, balancing effortlessly on its thick tail. Its front paws clenched. Its nostrils flared. It locked eyes with Zaraxil, and for a brief, horrifying moment, the ambassador understood what it meant to be prey. "What do I do?" Zaraxil hissed. Dawson slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, bright orange disc. Distract. Zaraxil had no idea what that meant. Dawson flicked the disc into the air. The kangaroo's head snapped toward it. Without hesitation, the creature launched itself toward the flying object, grabbing it with its powerful paws before landing in a cloud of dust. Dawson whistled. "Nice catch, big guy." Zaraxil was trembling. "You taught them to chase flying objects?" "Oh yeah," Dawson said casually. "They love it. We turned it into a sport. People bet on roo reflexes all the time." "You gamble on these creatures?" She raised an eyebrow. "Why wouldn't we?" Zaraxil had no response. He turned his gaze back to the kangaroo, who was now eyeing the disc in its paws with intense focus, as though considering whether to weaponize it. "Let's, keep moving," Dawson said. "Next stop, extreme sports." Zerxil was too stunned to object. The second part of the tour took place at what humans referred to as a sports complex. It was here that Zerxil discovered, to his increasing horror, that humans voluntarily hurled themselves off cliffs for entertainment, engaged in controlled combat for fun, and worst of all, allowed themselves to be kicked in the face by kangaroos as part of a competition. The event was called Kanga Boxing. The rules were simple. A trained participant would enter an enclosed ring, don protective padding, and attempt to dodge or deflect attacks from a fully grown kangaroo. The audience would cheer wildly. Bets would be placed. Zerxil watched as a human competitor, wearing absurdly large gloves, bounced on their feet inside the ring. The kangaroo, in contrast, stood completely still, unmoving, calculating. Then, with terrifying speed, it struck. Single, devastating kick launched the human backwards. The crowd erupted into cheers. The human got up grinning, as though enjoying the experience. "This is insanity," Zerxil whispered. Dawson smirked. "Nah, this is just Saturday." Zerxil was no longer convinced he was on a habitable planet. Nothing about this species made sense. They had created entertainment out of combat with apex predators. They thrived in chaos. And somehow they had domesticated these monsters. A sinking realization settled into Zerxil's mind. They had invaded the wrong planet. There would be no conquest, no glorious victory. There was only survival, and at this rate even that was uncertain. The longer High Ambassador Zerxil remained on Earth, the more convinced he became that the YLTRX Dominion had made the gravest mistake in its history. He had studied war, he had studied diplomacy, but nothing had prepared him for this. His mind was still reeling from what he had just witnessed. Kanga Boxing, a sanctioned event where humans voluntarily entered combat with creatures powerful enough to shatter their bones. Not only that, but they seemed to enjoy it. The crowd had roared in excitement. Bets had been placed. The human competitor, despite being sent flying by a kick that would have turned most YLTRX into fine paste, had simply stood back up, shook it off, and gone in for another round. Zerxil had seen species that prided themselves on their endurance. But this was not endurance. This was something else entirely. And yet Dawson was acting like this was completely normal. "All right, big guy," she said, clapping him on the back, hard enough to nearly dislocate his shoulder. "Next stop, dinner." Zerxil was already regretting his existence. He followed her, still trying to process the madness. He had barely survived the wildlife sanctuary. He had barely survived witnessing Kanga Boxing. He wasn't sure if he would survive whatever horror awaited him next. But the YLTRX Dominion demanded knowledge, and so, with the grim resignation of a being marching toward its doom, he stepped into what humans called a restaurant. It smelled odd. The air was thick with strange, sizzling aromas. It was a chaotic environment, loud, colorful, filled with humans talking, laughing, clinking glasses, and throwing knives at a target on the wall for entertainment. Zerxil flinched as a blade whizzed past his head and embedded itself into a wooden board. A man in a cowboy hat pumped his fist. "That's a bullseye, mate." Dawson barely glanced at him. "Oh, don't worry. That's just for fun. Nobody gets hurt. Well, usually." Zerxil decided not to ask for elaboration. They were led to a table. The human server approached, far too cheerful for Zerxil's comfort. "What'll it be, folks?" Dawson grinned. "Bring out the works. The ambassador here wants to experience Earth culture." The server's eyes gleamed. "Oh, mate, you're in for a ride." Zerxil was afraid. Within minutes, plates of food were set before him. His translator struggled. The first dish was a massive slab of charred meat. "Ribeye steak," Dawson said. "Good stuff." Zerxil stared at it. This appears to be the remains of a creature. Yup, you consume your own fauna? Dawson blinked. Yeah? Don't tell me your species doesn't eat meat. Zrexil considered lying. But his survival instincts were screaming that humans could detect weakness, so he simply nodded. He cautiously picked up the fork and knife Dawson had given him and attempted to mimic her actions. The moment he sliced into the meat, red liquid oozed from it. He nearly dropped his utensils. "It is bleeding," Dawson snorted. "Nah, that's just the juices. Medium rare. Best way to eat it." Zrexil stared at her. "You prefer your sustenance in a state close to undeath?" Dawson laughed. "Man, you should see some people. They eat it blue, barely cooked at all." Zrexil began calculating how fast he could reach his ship, but the nightmare was not over. Next came a bowl of red, viscous material with chunks of something floating inside it. "Chili," Dawson said, setting a bottle next to it. "And here's some hot sauce if you want to really go for it." Zrexil peered at the dish. "Define hot." Dawson leaned forward, eyes twinkling. "Spicy. We like a little danger in our food. You voluntarily introduced danger into your own nourishment." Dawson shrugged. "Sure. Keeps things exciting." Zrexil watched in horror as she poured a liberal amount of the so-called hot sauce into her bowl and took a bite. She chewed, swallowed, then wiped at her eyes. "Ooh, that's got some kick." Zrexil glanced down at his own bowl, then at the bottle of hot sauce, which had a flaming skull on the label. The text read, "Caution, use at your own risk, may cause temporary loss of vision, respiratory failure, and spiritual awakening." Zrexil put his spoon down and folded his hands neatly in his lap. "I will abstain." Dawson smirked. "Smart." The meal continued. Zrexil learned of a dish called buffalo wings, which, despite the name, contained no buffalo and were instead drenched in another variety of fire liquid. He was introduced to something called Vegemite, which Dawson had insisted was an acquired taste. One small whiff had nearly caused his brain to shut down. By the end of the meal, Zrexil had learned a horrifying truth. Humans did not simply eat for sustenance, they ate for sport. The meal was an experience, a challenge, a test of their own biological limits. And just when he thought he was finally safe, when he thought the terror was over, Dawson casually dropped the worst bombshell of them all. "You should see what we drink," she said, grinning. "Ever heard of moonshine?" Zrexil's vision went dark at the edges. An hour later, he sat in his quarters, trembling. He had come here as a diplomat, a representative of the Yltarex Dominion. He had expected to engage in negotiations with an inferior species. Instead, he had discovered gods of chaos and destruction. They fought apex predators for entertainment. They hurled themselves off mountains for recreation. They turned food into a test of physical endurance. And worst of all, they were so casual about it. Dawson had shown no fear. None of them had. They enjoyed the madness. Zrexil activated his personal recorder and took a deep breath. "This is High Ambassador Zrexil of the Yltarex Dominion," he said. His voice was shaking. "I have concluded my preliminary observations of humanity." He swallowed. "My report is as follows. We are doomed." He took another breath. "Earth is a death world. The humans are not merely resilient. They are thrill-seeking lunatics who have somehow turned survival into a form of entertainment. They befriend monsters. They engage in ritual combat with apex predators. They ingest toxic substances for fun." He shuddered. "I do not know how they have survived this long. I do not know how any species in this galaxy has survived knowing they exist. I only know one thing for certain." His hands clenched. His eyes darkened. "We must never make an enemy of them." He ended the recording and sat in silence. Outside, in the streets of the human city, the sounds of chaos and laughter filled the air. Zaraxil curled up in a ball and prayed to the stars. High Ambassador Zaraxil had not slept. He could not sleep. His mind had been permanently branded with the horrors of the past 24 hours. He had witnessed creatures of impossible strength tear through a highly trained invasion force. He had seen humans treat personal injury as a minor inconvenience and laugh in the face of danger. He had observed their dining habits, which seemed to be a form of voluntary torture disguised as sustenance. Now, as he sat rigidly in the human diplomatic hall, waiting for the final round of negotiations, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The YLTRX Dominion must never, under any circumstances, provoke the humans. Unfortunately, the Supreme High Council was still unconvinced. A hologram flickered before him, displaying the stern, crystalline features of Chancellor Ivlox. Ambassador Zraxil, we have reviewed your preliminary report. Zraxil exhaled. And Ivlox's translucent skin rippled in a shade of mild skepticism. While your descriptions of Earth's dangers are concerning, we do not believe it is cause for immediate alarm. Zraxil felt something inside him snap. Not cause for alarm. His voice rose an octave. Chancellor, I have seen the humans. I've stood among them. I've witnessed their daily lives, and I tell you now, they are not a species. They are a catastrophe given form, the council members murmured among themselves. Another figure leaned forward, High Strategist Virkan, the military advisor. We understand your hesitations, but the Dominion has conquered countless systems. Surely, if necessary, we could neutralize— No! Zraxil's mandibles clicked together in horror. You do not neutralize humans, you survive them. There was a pause. Ivlox frowned. Explain. Zraxil took a slow breath. We invaded this planet with one of our most elite strike forces. They landed in a region the humans call Australia. Do you know what happened? The council waited. The wildlife killed them in under 13 minutes. There was a brief silence. Virkan scoffed. You exaggerate. Zraxil's fingers twitched. We landed. We barely stepped foot onto their soil before we were attacked by kangaroos. Ivlox's expression darkened. These kangaroos are the dominant species? Zraxil buried his face in his hands. No, humans are. The kangaroos are just their side characters. He lifted his head, eyes wild. Do you understand what that means? We were wiped out by their background creatures. Do you know what humans are capable of? The council members were silent. Zraxil stood up abruptly, pacing. Chancellor, do you know what I witnessed yesterday? I saw a human willingly enter combat with a kangaroo for sport. He whirled around, voice rising. And do you know what happened? The kangaroo kicked him through the air like a rag doll, and the human just stood back up and asked for another round. Virkan's crystalline skin rippled in disbelief. That is impossible. Is it? Zraxil screeched. Because I assure you, that was not even the most insane thing I saw. They willingly consume poisons. They jump off cliffs for entertainment. They throw themselves into hurricanes because it looks fun. The murmurs among the council grew louder. Ivlox hesitated. This does not align with our previous intelligence. Humanity was believed to be a fragile species. Fragile? Zraxil's voice cracked. They wrestle apex predators for fun. I witnessed a human drink a liquid, so corrosive it melted metal, and when I asked him why, do you know what he said? The council waited. He shrugged and said, builds character. Silence, utter silence. Finally, Ivlox spoke, his tone careful. Ambassador, you are certain of these observations? Zraxil inhaled sharply. Chancellor, I will tell you for the final time, the YLTRX Dominion must never make an enemy of humanity. We will not conquer them. We will not provoke them. We will not even look at them funny. We will call them our dear friends, and we will send them gift baskets, and we will pray to the stars that they never look at us the way they looked at that chili bowl." The council remained quiet. Then, for the first time in his career, Zruxil saw something on their faces he never expected to see. Fear. Vivlox nodded slowly. "We shall reconsider our position on Earth." Zruxil slumped in relief. "Good, very good. Excellent choice." But just as he thought the nightmare was over, Dawson strolled into the room, grinning like someone about to cause problems. "All right. Ambassador, negotiations are set for tomorrow," she said. "But since we wrapped up early, I figured you might want to come with me to see something special." Zruxil had reached his limit. "No!" Dawson raised an eyebrow. "What? You don't even know what it is?" "It doesn't matter," Zruxil said, standing so fast his chair nearly fell over. "Every time I accompany you somewhere, I discover new horrors. I have reached my threshold. I am at capacity." Dawson pouted. "But this one's real cool. Ever heard of the running of the bulls?" Zruxil's breath hitched. "Let me get this straight," he said, voice thin. "You voluntarily release enraged multi-ton beasts into the streets, then run for your lives just to see if you can outrun them?" Dawson shrugged. "Yeah, pretty much." Zruxil turned and walked out of the room. "Where are you going?" Dawson called. "Back to my ship." "Oh, come on, it's fun! You people are a plague upon reality." Zruxil didn't stop until he was inside his vessel. He slammed his hand against the emergency recall button. The ship's AI beeped. "Ambassador, are you initiating a full retreat?" "Yes." The engines roared to life. Zruxil collapsed into his chair, shaking. As the ship lifted off, he made one final transmission to the YLTRX Dominion. "This is high. Ambassador Zruxil, effective immediately, Earth is to be classified as a level Omega death world. Under no circumstances should any military action be taken against humanity. Instead, they are to be regarded as unpredictable allies of terrifying strength. Additionally, I strongly recommend sending them tributes of alcohol, spicy food, and possibly a few boxing gloves for their marsupial warlords, just in case." There was silence on the other end, then a single fearful reply. "Understood." As Zruxil left Earth's atmosphere, he gazed down at the blue planet below and whispered a final prayer of thanks. He had survived. But deep in his soul, he knew one thing. For certain, the universe would never be the same.